this is the next to the last book for our first season of the book club, first year of the book club. And actually, we've had discussions on 13 books. We will have had discussions on 13 books. This will be our 12th discussion. And we'll be coming up with a 13th discussion at the very end of this month. And that will conclude our spring 2024 portion. And then we're going to jump off with at least one book and possibly two for the summer season, which will be one in August and one in September, hopefully. So that's where we're going from here. We have Matt Albertson with us tonight, fortunately. we have a discussion on this book, Outside the Lines of Gilded Age Baseball. And this is book 2 of a 4-book series. So, and this was more fascinating than the first book. That sounded very interesting. So I'm going to turn it over to Bob Bailey, who'll give you some of the basic ground rules, and we'll go from there.
Well, not much in the book club. The moderator generally encourages questions and comments. Fisticuffs are another story, but we'll see what we can do here. Yeah, the subtitle on this book is Gambling, Umpires, and Racism in the 1880s Baseball. So, Matt, if you'd like to get started, we'll get going.
Sure. I will start with a brief anecdote related to our previous conversation, that if you go to the grave of, what's his name? Oh, I can't think of it now. It's terrible. I just lost my mind. John Wilkes Booth, you put a penny on the grave for a different reason. And so if you go to his grave, there's pennies all over the place in Baltimore. Anyway, back to baseball. So I won't go into the author introduction as I did the last time. Don't need to be too repetitive. But this time we dealt with gambling, umpires in a lot of different ways, Sunday baseball, mascots, and racism in 1880s baseball. And I don't know if anybody caught on, but in our first installment, we did take note that the majority of the examples that Bauer provides are from the latter 1880s, and he's trying to say that this is representative of the whole decade. If you look at the source material, the majority of the citations are from the Sporting Life and the Sporting News. So Sporting Life founded in 1883, Sporting News founded in 1885. I don't know why he's sticking from really 86 really to 89 for a lot of his material, but that's where we're at. So we'll get started with the first chapter after I rambled on a bit and wasted a bit of time. He starts off with gambling. I thought this was a weird way to start the book, considering the bulk of the book dealt with umpires. So that's just a format thing that I thought was unique. He starts with gambling, and I'll be honest, I wasn't overly convinced that this really needed to be a chapter in the book. He does mention that gambling is a problem in the 1870s. We recall, of course, the 1877 Louisville Grays being a major case in the 1870s and gambling and throwing games. And then he goes off and Bauer goes off and says that gambling in the 1880s really wasn't a problem, but it was the specter of gambling. So was gambling itself a problem in the 1880s?
Well, if I might comment on that, it's a kind of dual-edged sword. Of course, if your team loses, it becomes, well, why did they lose? And I grew up in a neighborhood where there was a lot of gambling when I was a kid, and I kind of remember some of the older guys really you know, saying that, something wasn't on the up and up. The game was thrown or it went against their bet. So that was always and I think that was probably very true again in the 19th century. I don't think human behavior, changed that much, if at all. And I think that there was a very similar response. There was always the specter of gambling, uh, to hang your hat on, if you lost a bet.
Well, another thing there was not the gambling per se, but the nefarious individuals often involved in the gambling, attracting them to the ballpark and then making it less attractive for money spending upper middle class folks and the ladies, of course.
I'd like to comment. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, Woody, I don't know if you're able to, but you're
Very
when you talk, it's very quiet. Are you able to move your microphone a little closer, perhaps?
Yeah, I can move me a little closer.
Fair enough. That'll work. Jack, go ahead.
Yeah. That's interesting what you said about the whole specter of gambling, because in all of my research, I noticed that quite a bit. And for the SABR group, I did a talk last year on the 1886 championship games, and St. Louis trounced Chicago, and there were accusations of gambling. And Eugene Field, who wrote Wink and Blink and a Nod, who was a famous Chicago Daily News columnist, he insisted there was gambling going on, but there really were absolutely no proven charges whatsoever. And people looked and looked, but they couldn't find anything. But just because they lost and they weren't expected to lose, people said that there was gambling involved.
What I along with what Jack said, when you read through the 1880s, 1870s papers, there's always specters of gambling. Nobody trusted the umpires. Of course, even the league owners were kind of rough on them, and just if they didn't like what they're doing, they just fired them and found someone else. But also, there was just no concept in the public of an upset. If the wrong team won, had to be gambling. There had to be a crooked umpire, or it had to be something on there that caused that. And it was not in the 20th century that we started to understand that there would be the Philadelphia Athletics would lose to the Washington Senators occasionally.
I mean, I'll use a modern example, and I'll pull Paul in because I know he's out in Colorado. The Phillies never play well in Denver. They can't do it. The Colorado Rockies were one of the worst teams in baseball, and the Phillies among the best. And they go out there and they lose 2 out of 3. So if we transpose that series back to the 1880s, is Bryce Harper on the take? He's usually pretty good. They had it. To go on to your point there, Bob, it seemed they had no concept of a slump or the fact that sometimes teams might not just play well in certain cities, or for whatever reason that travel might impact them. Any number of things. A player might not always play up to snuff that he was expected to. And I think that's a great point. So we give this, he was on a take.
Would that also be with the sports writers were not exactly conversant with everything going on in sport at the time, and that was the easy column to write. Our guys got jobbed by the umpire. The guys in left field in that section 15 were betting on the other team, or whatever it may be. But whenever you'd be there, Boston would play Columbus and win 3 in a row and lose the 4th. And how could that happen? The headlines.
We was robbed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something real quick, and I keep coming back to this. Couple things. First of all, I really think that what's interesting to me is the whole gambling aspect of it and the unsavory characters. In every single book we've pretty much gone over, in one way or another, we've talked about the unsavory characters. We've talked about, even in the fiction book, we talked about McCarran. We talked about in the Murphy Brothers, we talked about fencing in the ground to keep the unsavories out. And then I also think it's interesting. You mentioned a little bit about the ladies, Jack.
Yeah.
I think
Mhm.
that to me, it's interesting in the evolution of the game, gambling goes hand in hand with it. Whereas gambling was there, it was prevalent. What are we going to do about it? We're going to attract more savory people. We're going to attract ladies. We're going to put fences up. So the evolution of the game, in a lot of ways, ties back to that gambling aspect of let's get these people out and get good people in. How do we do that? So I think that's an interesting concept. But I also want to say real quick about about the book so far. One of my favorite phrases or things in there was the two players that were on the take for the same team. And they were like the pitcher and the shortstop. Oh, really? And they're both betting against each other. I thought that was an amazingly humorous
Yeah.
anecdote
Mhm.
where the pitcher was like, okay, well, I can't throw it to him because he's going to drop the ball. And I got to do this. I got to do that.
Then he
It was
threw it
really
40
cool.
feet in the air.
Yeah, he threw it over
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
He went around the whole game and avoided like, okay, if I throw this, it's not going to get hit to the shortstop. And then he chucked it over there. So
I just can't imagine a ball hit to Trey Turner to end a game, and he just sails one into the third deck. I mean, I just love the sight of that.
I have two words for you, Matt. Chuck Knobloch. Okay? Say no more, buddy.
Mhm.
I'm a Yankees fan. I know all about Chuck and his yips.
You know, I can't help but recollecting when reading about gambling at that period. I can't help recollecting about my own experiences in my first career, and I had a couple of bookmaking cases that were involved sports betting, and it was actually in Francis Tavern, and I asked Francis Tavern is a historic tavern where Washington gave his farewell address to his officers at the conclusion of the Revolution, and I asked the district attorney's office if I could put the phone up. They were using a phone booth in the lobby, and he said, "Oh, you can't do that. Not in that historic place." But what he gave me was subpoenas. So, we knew basically where the guys were coming from that were placing the bets. Not, that's what we couldn't catch the bookmaker yet. So we started with the guys placing the bets, and he gave me subpoenas, and I ended up having to take two guys off the floor of the stock exchange in New York. And, one guy was just adamant, just lied, like, I don't know what you're talking about, And the district attorney, the ADA, was saying to him, "Are you calling this officer a liar?" The other guy, when he came in the room, he says, "What do you want to know?" But now we have, for the first time, in at least my lifetime, the first time that sports betting is legal. And there's been some articles written in, like the Times and other places that, question is, what is this going to lead to? What eventually will this lead to? There's a lot of money involved in sports betting.
There
And,
were four or five players just this past week that received bans for sports betting, particularly on baseball. So
Right.
it's still a very relevant topic. One got permanently banned. So
I think that's disgusting, just for the record, and I'm just sorry for going a quick soapbox, but I think it's disgusting that Pete Rose isn't in the Hall of Fame for betting on baseball and other people are. And yet, every time I turn on the TV, it's like, oh, look at this by Sportbook or that, whatever. There's even like, in between the game. And, then you've got these players that are betting on it. They're surrounded by it and they bet on it. They take part and they're like, oh, how dare you? You're kicked out of the game. And it's such an oxymoron for these leagues that they're willing to take all this money and just, use it for whatever they want. And then look, oh my God, you're shamed publicly forever because you did it. So I'm sorry, it's a small soapbox. I'll stop.
We can talk more about that elsewhere, Paul, because you and
I
I would be at
apologize.
loggerheads.
What's that?
You and I would be at loggerheads on that debate.
That's
So
Can I make one quick comment though about Pete Rose, Paul? For another SABR chapter, had the guy who just did the Pete Rose biography, and there were questions. Yeah, and there were questions at the end, and naturally someone said, "Do you think he should be in the Hall of Fame?" And he said he just doesn't answer that question. He just said he prefers to let the reader decide for him or herself.
yeah, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
While I get to the final question here on gambling chapter, in what ways did fans bet on the game? Where did they do it? Did players bet on the game? So I'll just start this with a little bit of Kingling. I didn't know that the scores were sent to saloons during the game.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea that actually happened, that they were wired to saloons and the scores posted on boards there, which would have led to a bit of riffraff and I imagine gambling between fans. And then we get to this interesting topic, players betting on games, and he seems to believe, Bauer, that is the author, that players typically only bet on their teams to win. And that's when we get into that anecdote of the shortstop versus the pitcher. So how often do players bet on games in 1880s baseball? I don't think he really explained it a whole lot. It didn't seem like it happened very often.
Yeah, it was certainly not openly discussed, I don't think, too often in his sources. I don't think that the Sporting Life or the Sporting News particularly were really any really crusading reporters, really. They were just kind of like more fan-based reporting and telling you what the local team was doing or what they were paying for a guy or so forth and so on, and what chances they had of securing the pennant. But very little in the way of really delving into some of the darker things in the game.
Well, they may have made a distinction back then, at least the players among themselves, about betting for your team as opposed to betting against your team. For your team, that's that might have been what was going on.
Right.
Well, if you bet against, can't you have more effect on your team losing than you can purposely losing, as opposed to purposely winning, because you're just going to try to do your best. So if somebody's going to pay you to lose a game, they're not going to pay you to win a game.
You can guarantee to play poorly. You can't always guarantee to play well.
Yeah.
Which is why we have this problem, right?
Well, Bob, the club pays you to win the game.
Well, true enough. But I think there's also the situation where, as well as the players were paid relative to the average man in the street, they had extra money in their pocket. Therefore, they could go to the saloon, and if there's somebody from out of town, say, "We're going to kill you tomorrow," and he says, "Oh, $10 says you won't," and you get those sort of things. I'm sure that there were plenty of betting. I'm not sure that it was run in a way that we saw in the early 20th century, where outside financiers were putting together situations or trying to subvert three players on a team in a specific series. I wouldn't be surprised if there was plenty of gambling going on in the World Series of the 1880s. I don't know if the players were in them, but I'm sure there was plenty of money passing hands.
And you talked about the difficulty in guaranteeing in betting to win and guaranteeing that ability. I can't speak to the 1880s, when I did the book on the 1920 season with the White Sox a year after the World Series scandal, there was a lot of talk and a lot of rumors going on about the gamblers still holding on to those guys and manipulating the odds day by day simply to make it a close race in July and August. And that means sometimes you pay the players to lose and sometimes you pay the players to win. And it really struck me at the time, how difficult is it to pay the players to win?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The
That's
other
the
team's
hardest bet,
trying
right?
too. You
That's
know,
the harder bet.
yeah.
Something he occasionally mentions in the book that in one or two circumstances that the clubs actually permitted betting on the ball grounds. I thought that was different. I think Washington was one case in like 1886 or something like that. And then they realized this is probably a bad idea. Maybe we ought not to allow that. And that leads me to the final question here for the gambling chapter is, why does this matter? Why does it matter if fans, if players bet on games, if unsightly people, those in the shadows, cook the books, so to speak? Why is this important? Why is it important today?
People are paying their admission to see a game that's honest or at least competitive, or that everybody's doing their best. And if it's going to become, in the term of the 1880s, hippodroming, why would they go? Read it in the paper the next day.
Right. And why is that important that the people go?
Because they pay their money.
It's important for organized baseball.
Yeah, well, you got to have.
For the game to be on
They're
the
not
level.
going to get people investing money in baseball teams if there's no way to make money at it.
Right. Right. Despite what Rob Manfred said in our recent player lockout, that I think he did say that owners don't make money in baseball. Yeah, that's the whole goal, right? To make money, to make a profit. Any other comments, questions on the gambling portion, our leadoff hitter in this book?
Well, just to add that it's also the period in American history that gave rise to Comstock.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was a whole kind of morals period where we,
Yeah.
where he kind of challenged them, the powers to be, or challenged, to be more forceful against morals crimes.
Right.
You know.
I just had one comment. I didn't find it to be all that strange. I thought there was a lot of gambling that went on in the country in that era anyway, whether it was horse racing or boxing or anything else. It's what people did and what people do now. And I mean, if you think about it, just think about what happened in the Tour de France when our boy lost. Well, he won 6 or 7 in a row, and then all of a sudden it was all taken away from him.
Yeah.
I mean, that was cheating too. And people turned away from the sport for a year or two. I don't know. I don't know that it's fully turned away, but
yeah,
I think there was a real concern back then about baseball, and I think it's now that we've got gambling full time. I think it's another concern now.
I think Jerry makes a very interesting point. Back in the 1880s, there were only 3 significant sports in the country: baseball, horse racing, and boxing. Boxing and horse racing, gambling is central to them. And so it was almost natural that gambling would come up with regard to baseball. There wasn't really an alternative.
Right. Yeah, even like cricket has a resurgence in the 1880s, but it's minor. Cycling, minor, same. So yeah, absolutely. It's intertwined with all 3 of those. So I'm going to conflate all our next 4 chapters into one here, because it deals with the guy that nobody likes, Angel Hernandez. No, the umpires. So, to lead us off, why are umpires critical to baseball's success in this period? Is it from, the arbiter of rules? They keep the game moving, or is there
Well,
something else to it?
It's much like the gambling. You want to have an honest game so the fans will come and feel that they're getting something there. But the umpires were never supported. It was never a critical part of it. You go back to 1850s, and it was one of the umpire was one of the players on the home team, and it kind of grew in the National League. What was it? I don't think they put it in their constitution until something like 1888 that they would pay umpires, although they did pay them in the middle 1880s. American Association started having their own staff in 1882, but didn't stop everybody from saying they're all crooked, because there was no concept that somebody could have a difference of opinion.
Right.
I
The
I
game
think
is
it
to
goes.
be on the level, right? So if the game's to be on the level, you need to ensure you have a guy that can be level-headed behind the plate. Go ahead, Jerry. I cut you off.
No problem. It goes back to something somebody said earlier about the fact that there wasn't much record keeping. There wasn't much history. People didn't understand slumps. They had their preconceived notion, and the home team fans were even more rabid probably than they are now. This was their team, so they expected their team to always win. And if there was a close call, naturally it was the umpire at fault, if there was an umpire. So that was just the sense I had, was that baseball was so new that they really didn't have that much of a concept of refereeing at that point.
Well, another thing with a single umpire, there were many more bad calls, mistaken calls. And of course, it's easy to start thinking, well, he made a mistake, he's crooked. What, you're sitting someplace in the field, in the stands, where you could see it clearly, and you can say, well, it's obviously a wrong call. The umpire's crooked.
Beyond that, there's an element of familiarity breeds contempt to this too. I think in the 1880s, I know in the 90s, and I think in the 80s, a lot of teams, basically one guy worked most of a team's home games.
Yeah.
Or worked in a small region, maybe Louisville and Cincinnati, or St. Louis, Chicago, things like that. Tom Lynch worked almost all of his games between Boston and New York. And so you saw the same umpires all the time. And my guess is that wasn't very conducive to popularity.
I remember reading in Peter Morris's book, But Didn't We Have Fun? Back in the early days, the umpires were like a very prominent members of the community. But then things started, and back then a player's honor was at stake. If he was out, he admitted he was out, or someone was safe and everything. But then it gradually changed, and the umpire had to be more subjective, and he had to start calling people out. And then, of course, players got more involved, arguing with the umpire, and that's when Peter Morris mentioned that the whole game itself started changing, and it wasn't so much a gentleman's game anymore. And this is partly due to the role of the umpire.
Money, professionalism.
Yeah, professionalism, right.
There was something at stake, more tangible to many people than honor.
Mhm.
Well, even the popular culture in baseball, root for the home team. If they don't win, it's a shame. It kind of underscores, root for your team. Woody, kind of what you were talking about a little earlier. But that, by the late 1960s, that was the argument, NFL versus baseball, in that if the home team didn't win, nobody went to the games, and it was going to have a bad time. And you get teams like the Senators and others who lost the Browns over and over and over. But the NFL said on any given Sunday, any team could win. That was Pete Rozell's idea there. And you go every week to see what might happen.
Yeah. How could good umpires be secured and protected?
Say that
So
again.
they
How
weren't.
could good umpires be secured and protected?
They weren't. You see them quit all the time, come back the next season. What Gaffney was always thought to have been a very, very good umpire. And he just got fed up with ragging from the benches, the fans and whatnot. And he would drop out for a couple of months and come back the next season. But it wasn't the first guy that I can think of that started to say, we're going to protect the umpires was Ban Johnson in the Western League. And that was put against the 1890s what was it, Bill, brawl game?
So a couple of news writers.
In the 1890s, you had about 7, 8 umpires. They basically, one guy, I can't remember his name now, basically umpired most of the Louisville games, and he quit in mid-season because he was just got so much abuse.
Yeah, and that happened all the time. And because I remember reading about Nick Young, president of the National League. He was the secretary for a couple decades earlier. And his attitude was, well, I can't, I'll talk to the guy or send him a telegram. And if he won't say, I'll just go get somebody else. And usually he would talk to owners. And the owners are the guys that tended to drive funk out, because some of the owners would set their players on the umpires. And then you had managers like McGraw and Tebow and Comiskey and whatnot. That was their style.
There was a famous series between Baltimore and Boston in '97, in August of '97, up in Boston, where Tom Lynch took so much abuse one day that he just decided he wasn't going to show up the next day. It's the only umpire assigned. They went out and found somebody named Bob Carpenter from the New England League to umpire the game, and they said, well, how are we going to protect this rookie against all the Orioles and the abuse they're going to take? You know what they did? They brought in 3 Boston police officers to be on the field and back Carpenter up. And the officers literally intervened with the Orioles when the Orioles tried to protest with Carpenter's decisions.
Well, I was going to say, I think the answer in a lot of ways, Matt, is a simple answer, but not a simple answer. And it actually it made me ask more questions than got answers. And originally I thought, well, pay him more. If you pay him more, you'll get better umpires, more will show up and they'll retain him. Why would you go for this abuse? Pay him more. And they started out obviously like $1,000 a season. They went up to $2,500 a season. And I started to ask a question, how much money was that? Was that a lot of money? And then I did a little research before we actually started this. I found this cool little anecdote. I just wanted to throw it out there for a minute. Let me see here. In 1890, laborers in New York City earned $6 to $9 per week. Divided by a 56-day work week, that's $1 to $1.50 per day. So I just did a quick, simple math. And if you take 52 weeks in a year and take it and multiply it by $9, it's $468. So they're already making 3 times more than an average laborer, but was it enough? I mean, I wondered if it was a low wage, but wow, that's a really high salary for that day and age. So that was fascinating to me.
He mentions that, like he talks to both sides of the argument. Like some of the writers in the newspapers and correspondents to the Sporting Life and Sporting News would say, well, you got to pay umpires more money, that in order to withstand this abuse. And that's when, I think he mentions in specific 1888 or whatever it was, that the American Association lured away 2 great umpires from the National League. and they had these 4 great umpires, and they were going to have, you know, the most honest games, and the umpires who wouldn't be swayed and would be able to handle all the abuse because they had the reputation for doing all of that. And it turned out after they had the market on that, then they decided to cut salary. So they thought they could get away. Like, why are we paying $1,000 more? It wasn't like it was that much better in the first place. So yeah, so like we talk about paying them, and then another mention, Bill, you mentioned this too, and he alludes to it in the book, is, well, some of the writers said, why don't we bring out police? But what's the problem with police in the 1880s?
They were just as bad as the fans.
Yep.
Right. They're not exactly professional police like we think of today, like Peter. So they, you know, they had pistols and billy clubs and everything like that, but could they be swayed too? I don't see why not. And where are they going to be from? They're probably going to be from the home city, right? Which gets us to my next question, which is, did umpires favor the home team in the 1880s?
Some of them certainly did.
Good reason for that, right? To protect themselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
A lot of close calls, you know, given a single umpire, and under the circumstances, it's a coin flip. We'll call it 3/4 of the time in favor of the home team.
Even still, there was more where they were coerced into doing it one way or another. I like the one account where they talked about the one umpire, and they're like, "Yep, that ball was 10-foot foul," and the guy shows them a snub-nosed pistol. You sure about that? Yeah, it was 10-foot foul. Click. How sure are you about that? You know, it looked fair to me. So how do they favor the home team? Did they have a choice sometimes? I mean, if you really went down that far down the rabbit hole.
So in the 1880s, home teams had a .583 winning percentage for the entire decade, which trails only the 1890s with a .603 winning percentage. And then he dives into that, and you think, well, that's egregious, right? Like, these umpires are terrified. And, you know, Al Odlin's out there trying to withstand all the abuse from the Philadelphia fans. And you know, he's going to just side with them. And then you realize that it didn't happen as much in the 1880s as the 90s. But, you know, if the Washington Senators are really bad, you know, we're going to move some of these home games to New York or to Baltimore, where we can get a better share of the gate, and that's going to impact this winning percentage. But yeah, umpires did side with the home side more often than you might expect.
And that high winning percentage, you know, I think has a lot to do with why the owners stuck with a single umpire. They could have tried to, you know, all those different owners for several years. It's been pointed out it wasn't all that much money. So why didn't they do it? Well, that may be the reason. It meant more home wins.
But
Right.
the leagues themselves were weak. I mean, you know, certainly a lot weaker than they are. And I don't think things materially changed until there was some strengthening in the league offices, and they got better handle on teams.
It's a great point. That's a great point. What did umpires do to irritate fans and players?
Showed up.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Let me see if I can pick up an anecdote, because I had a good reason for asking this question, but I don't. Yeah. Fines. That's one of the tools that the league gave, or both leagues rather, gave umpires as a way to withstand this abuse, right? They're able to fine players. And one example he gives, he fines Charlie Comiskey $75, which was like 10% of his yearly salary at one time. Not that Comiskey paid.
But almost no fine. Players almost never paid their fine. The owner paid the fine.
Paid a fine, yeah.
Right.
And so as long as they didn't get a fine every game, the owner is going to sit there and say, yeah, I've got to push that umpire. Because the idea was you could intimidate or at least influence the umpire in one way or another.
The
Right.
players got fined for complaining or kicking, as they called it. I know that, and the umpires would fine them quite often for that. I remember reading.
Because it was in the 1890s, I think, that you started to see a rule that if a captain or manager took his team off the field,
Yeah.
he would be fined.
Mhm.
And the rule said that the club couldn't pay the fine. I'm sure
Yeah.
there's lots of under the table
Mhm.
passing of money, and that never really happened. But the owners aren't going to do that. If they're paying the players fine, they're sitting there saying that's a cost of doing business.
Mhm. Mhm.
The practice of evening, in quotes, evening. So the umpire blows a call, and then you know what? I'm just gonna make it up right here, unashamedly. I'm just gonna make it up right here, and it irritated fans and players even more because it was quite obvious he had no idea what he had no idea what he was doing, right? And evidently home fans booed the umpire when their team scored runs if it was an evening situation. I'll take runs any way I can get them.
Nothing's changed.
Yeah, I'm not sure evening has gone away.
Yeah.
We'll watch a hockey NHL game. I guarantee it hasn't gone away. There's no way.
And then in 1886, we get this interesting idea that still exists today. Don't question an umpire too much or you get tossed, which is a bigger issue then than it is now, because of the limitations on, your best nines out there. The guy on the bench might not be as great. And to have to use him, even if you had, he mentions in the book, sometimes teams didn't take their full complement of players on the road to save money. So if you're carrying one guy, he might be really out of position, and it's really going to hamper your team's ability to win the game.
When they did toss a manager, for example, Matt, I'm not sure. There's a lot of places didn't have clubhouses and that sort of thing. So where would they go? They would go sit in stands behind the dugout.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
A great place for him. A great place. While we're talking about umpires in the 1880s, I was kind of surprised that he didn't bring this up. Because in 1889, there is a Merkel's-Boner situation that actually happened 17 years prior to Merkel's-Boner. It happened between Boston and the Phillies in Philadelphia. King Kelly takes the ball. Somebody didn't complete the play. They ran down to first base, but didn't touch first base. The Boston player didn't touch first base. So it's a force out opportunity. And the fans realize what's going on, and they start to climb over the benches, over the seats, everything, to get onto the field, to get after the umpire. And Kelly is running around with the ball in his hand. He won't let anybody get the ball. And eventually, one of the Phillies players, I think it might have been Sid Farrar or somebody like that, finally gets the ball, tosses it to Ed Delahanty, who's at first base, and says, look, he's out. The problem was, despite having two umpires, remember this is 1889, so National League mandated, they're going to select one series each week to have two umpires, and this happened. The umpires were scared to wits and they ran away.
No.
So there's no, it's all completely lawless at Philadelphia ballpark. And eventually, the umpires run away terrified. King Kelly has to run for his life. Harry Wright has to protect King Kelly in the locker room to keep people from getting to Kelly. They get him on an omnibus with people throwing rocks and stuff at the cart, and away he goes. But yeah, that was at least worth 2 pages of material there, I thought, but he missed it. Never mind that. In what ways did leagues and writers seek to help umpires? So what tools did they give them? Or what proposals did they make to make it easier for the umpires to do their jobs more safely and accurately?
I'm
We've
going to
touched
say
on a
this.
few.
I'm going to say it's just once because I have to, because it's tongue in cheek. They did make one get an eye test for the record. Just saying. Couldn't resist.
So
Well, the
I
big
alluded
push
to it.
was two umpires.
Go ahead, Bob.
So the big push was for two umpires because that way you couldn't turn your head and miss and tempt the player to go and do something, cut a base or
Yeah.
trip a player or something of that nature. But the two umpires, it was into the 20th century before that became kind of standard. I want to say 05, 07, somewhere in there, because they would go back and forth. But the sports writers would write a nice story about it. Say, oh, the fans were being unfair to this guy, which did absolutely nothing.
Yeah, because they were also the one, crucifying the umpire, the week before. It worked both ways, right? All right. So anybody have anything else they want to talk about regards to 1880s umpires, or at least 1886 to 1889 umpiring? If not, let's talk about Sunday baseball. And this was kind of thrown in there, I thought, at random. So what are the policies in place for Sunday play in the 1880s? There's two major leagues. Generally speaking, he talks about two most often, National League, American Association. What are the two policies of the leagues for Sunday baseball?
Well, National League said no ball.
Yeah,
And that wasn't changed till what, 1892, when the leagues,
Big
when
league.
they absorbed the bulk of the American Association, because, and that goes the same thing with liquor and beer and other things. It's the Continental Sunday in the Midwest. Heavy German populations, St. Louis, Cincinnati were always, that was their business, was selling the beer. That's how they balanced the books, particularly Cincinnati.
Mm-hmm.
And in Chicago, they really pushed for it in '93 for the Chicago Exposition that was in town that year.
Oh.
And then that's one of the reasons they really pushed it. The guy who took, I have a senior moment, can't think of his name. He took Spalding's place as owner of Chicago. Or the
Jim
president
Hart.
of Chicago. Yeah, Jim Hart. Yeah, Jim Hart. I'm sorry. He took Spalding's place as president. Mhm. He made no bones about it. He gave interviews to the press saying, "No, Exposition is going to be here. We're going to have Sunday baseball."
So the association elects to be, quote unquote, the working man's league, right? So they're going to play on Sunday because they're offering, and I never thought about this before, but it makes sense, at least somewhat, that, they're going to offer half price tickets throughout the week while they're going to recoup some of those losses, hopefully on Sunday baseball, by also selling beer on Sunday.
Mhm.
And also playing baseball on Sunday. So what are some of the challenges that the association faces with certain localities throughout the U.S.?
That would be the strength of the ministerial association.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Organized religion, yeah.
How much noise could they make and get? I suspect that they weren't getting a lot of support from people who were willing to go to games. So
Right.
it was basically folks who didn't want to go themselves and didn't want anybody else to go.
Mhm.
One of the anecdotes used was about the New York City sheriff. And Bauer mentions that there was a game at the Polo Grounds on the Sly where 8,000 people showed up. I don't know how you get 8,000 people to show up just at random to the ballpark on a Sunday. I mean, it's probably published in the newspaper. It's pretty obvious that this game's going to happen, right? And it's on the league's schedule. But, people show up, whether it's in New York or in Philadelphia or maybe in Gloucester County, where the blue laws aren't as strong. Any other comments on Sunday baseball? This was a pretty quick chapter.
One real quick comment, Chicago had to get a new ballpark because it was leased. The ballpark they had was leased and they couldn't get out of the contract, which prohibited Sunday baseball, which led to a whole new park.
And you might find this interesting, Matt. What was the last city to lift the ban on Sunday baseball?
Philadelphia?
Yeah, Philadelphia.
Really?
And it was Connie Mack who I think really made the plea because, you know, he was he made his living through baseball. He didn't have a chewing gum company or a beer company. You know, that's what he did. He played baseball. And
Wasn't that in the early 30s,
yeah,
1930s?
the early 30s, at the beginning of the Depression. And that's when they finally lifted the ban. That was the last ban lifted. But they had some other rules, you know, of course. They couldn't start the game till a certain hour and so forth and so on. They couldn't play into a certain hour. They're still constricted a little. It was kind of odd. But when you look at the whole history of, you know, Sabbath laws, I know Alan Cohen had done a lot of research into this, you know, one of our committee members, and it's a fascinating thing. It's fascinating in law enforcement. I can remember like what was required of the public when I was a rookie cop, you know, just and compare that to what was required, you know, by the time I left the department and by the time and today. I mean, it's a much different world. They're selling beer.
Right. Mascots. Who or what were they? And what purpose did they serve? There were quite a few interesting ones, such as a chicken's head on a pike, I think, by the Detroit Wolverines. That was a new one after their mascot, their Newfoundland dog, was stolen. Things you never think you would see at a major league game, you know, a head on a pike. I didn't have that on my bingo card. But I think a lot of times it would be African-American boy or man. Sometimes a person with a deformity that players would like to have around for luck. Any others? What purpose did they serve?
In one case, again, I go back to Chicago because I know that pretty well. There was a little boy named Willie. I can't think of his last name, but he was picked because he had a miniature baseball uniform, and the ladies who went to the ballpark just absolutely loved him because he looked like just a gentlemanly young boy, and he was with the team for a few years. They go to away games. They even liked the players even liked the kid's mother, and one time Spalding ran into him like 15 years later, and they started talking just about old times. But then they also had the black young man named Clarence. I can't think of his last name now, but
Duval,
yeah, Duval. Yeah, thank you, Peter. But definitely this black stereotype and all the way around.
I remember a couple years ago, the first SABR convention I went to, somebody did a presentation on mascots, and I thought it was really, really cool. But one of the things I remember, and it's kind of come back to me a couple times, is mascots also seem to sometimes have a very short shelf life. If the team won, the mascot was there, and he was a good mascot. If the team lost, he didn't come back.
I think the underlying reason to have a mascot was superstition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you weren't winning, either you had the wrong guy or he lost his mojo or something. Who knows?
And you know what I found interesting, and at least it sounded like this in the book, that while Chicago had Clarence Duval, another man had submitted his salary and figures and everything to be Chicago's mascot for the next season, an African-American man who had been with was it like Indianapolis or Washington or some team that did awful the year before? And it's like, well, if this is all about superstition and good luck, why are we going to hire you? But it sounded like that this other club had kept them around the whole season. And I thought, if it's about superstition and luck, wouldn't you find another one? And then there are a few stories about, well, if he's actually really, a bona fide mascot, a true mascot, he gets kicked off the train. Well, he'll find us. If he's a true mascot, he'll find us, and we'll win games then. And damned if that didn't happen. On one or two occasions where the guy would get kicked off the train, the team lost that day because the mascot wasn't there, and then the next day the mascot showed up and they won. It's an outrageous kind of thing. And then that kind of and actually, Bob, can you allow me to share screen
Yeah, hold on.
quickly? And this will be a good parlay into our last chapter, which was a chapter on racism.
Okay, you should be good.
All right. So here we have the 1890s Phillies at spring training, I think in Jacksonville. Now we have a mascot, at least for the spring, a young African-American boy, unidentified, just said in the newspaper description that he was there with the team. So
Real quickly, Matt, one more thing. You mentioned Clarence Duval. Spalding took him to on his world tour, and he was just treated very, very poorly. I remember that was very hot on the ship, so they'd put him to work fanning the players with either palm fronds, or they'd have like an automatic fan that was powered by leg power. So he just made him just sit on that and power this fan just to keep people cool.
So what's the allure then for the mascot, the person? Is it just to be around the team?
Yeah, that's the impression I got. And
yeah.
And this guy Willie Hahn was his name, and he was treated very, very well. But he's also white too.
Right. And then there was the drunk monkey that was mentioned in the book.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Animal abuse was a thing apparently among mascots. Racism. I actually didn't get to this chapter. So if anybody wants to prod any questions, go ahead. But I know we touched a little bit on racism in the 1880s with the mascot thing, and then of course there's Moses Fleetwood Walker and the color ban in 1885, 86, when the majors become all white.
Yeah, this chapter I thought was a very it offered a lot. It offered a lot in a different way. First of all, the vast majority of the chapter is devoted to Clarence Duval's time with the Chicago World Tour, the 1888, 1889, 89 tour. And what Bob Bauer, the author, did with this chapter, he went to the sources that were writing right from the tour. Spalding had brought a fellow along that was kind of like a traveling secretary, and he was keeping track. And if I know you reported on that, Jack.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting. He treated what he did as an author is he took a kind of an up close view of what the dialogue was basically between the white players and Clarence Duval. What was the interchange? What was the conversations about? In what ways was he taunted? In what ways was he, made, of course he would use, terms of that period like massa, master, or, it was kind of like this kind of one-way it reinforced all of the racism of the period. And it was a very, very interesting approach because he really got into kind of a microscopic view of what that was about, what those interchanges were about. Another thing I found very interesting, when he gets into the later part of the 1880s, well, he's already in the later part of the 1880s, but when he really talks about what he misses, kind of in a way, I was kind of shocked. He misses the final color line. He misses the color line drawn on July 14th, 1887, where he doesn't, he bounces all around it. He talks about Fleetwood Walker, and he talks about George Stovey, and he talks about Bud Fowler and everybody else that's being discriminated against.
Yeah.
But he misses that line. And I don't fault him for that. I mean, he wrote this book, quite a while ago, and he just didn't happen to come on that. I had a little bit of a leg up. I knew about it, and I made a couple of chapters, kind of devoted to that era in inventing baseball. But so it's kind of surprising. The interesting thing, and Bill did publish that book, by the way. I mean, edit that book. But there was one thing that didn't appear in I was in my manuscript, but it didn't make the book. But I finished off by saying that the Cuban Giants, on that very same day when all of this went down, on July 14th, 1887, the Cuban Giants beat the National League team, the Indianapolis team in the National League. So it was a kind of an irony. Here you were banning blacks, but at the same time, they were beating a National League team. So it was kind of interesting.
Do you think he could have expanded on this chapter at the expense of perhaps a weaker one?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Do you think he could have expanded on this chapter, perhaps at the expense of a weaker one?
I thought he could have. He took, I mean, his approach was different because he really got into kind of granular, interchanges between, Duval and the white players. It was kind of interesting in that respect. It does reinforce that the racism was really systemic, throughout society, and it was nothing really unique really going on there that wasn't going on, in other sectors of our culture.
I was going to throw something out real quick. So I may have mentioned this when we did the first book, but I was going to bring up Frank Grant real quick. So Frank Grant obviously played for Buffalo in the late 1880s. They say it may have been one of the reasons Buffalo was like, no, we don't want to, segregate. But there was an incident in Montreal where basically he was taunted pretty mercilessly, kill the N, all these sort of things. And it was written up, it was publicized. When I was working on a Buffalo book, I did some research and I was curious there's also said, if you look at the famous photograph of all the team, nobody's actually touching him. But what I thought was interesting, I went back and I read all the 3 years he was in Buffalo. I read through the game accounts, and there's never any mention of the home game accounts where there's never any mention of him being taunted. There's never any mention of him being, ostracized or his teammates. They never said anything about it. They talked about him as a baseball man, but nothing else. So I wondered some of those events, how secular they were. I mean, and I say that kind of, we talked about the home versus the away crowds, and it was the incident in Montreal, just we're taunting that player because of his skin, but we're also going to taunt another player because he's hitting against us. He's doing well against us. But I didn't read the chapter either, but it would have been interesting to maybe take a look at that side of him. Like I said, I'm fascinated with Frank Grant, so just my 2 cents.
Yeah, Frank Grant and Buffalo are discussed.
Okay, I'll have to look at it.
Well, it's mentioned, and it is discussed.
But I just thought it was really interesting, and I don't know if he says it or if anybody else has come across that, where Grant really had these racial incidents other than that one that was documented in Montreal. Like, I couldn't find anything, and I thought that was really that one secular incident that was really interesting that stood out to me.
And, with MLB and SABR's merger of the Negro League's statistics, and actually now they have crossed into the 19th century. So we should be a little bit more aware of it. I'm going to put out a kind of email about that, to our committee members, in the 19th century committee about, it kind of opening up a nice research door for us, and giving us a lot more topics to look at.
Grant played 3 seasons in Buffalo. Unlike Fowler, who never played with the same team he ended the last season with. But when he came over from a team in Connecticut State League, and 3 players came over. One of them was an old buddy of Jack Chapman, the manager of the team, Remsen, who's another Brooklyn guy. And I forget the third one. But suddenly he had folks that were his teammates on the team to start with, and he played so well to start. He started out hot, and he stayed hot. However, by the time we get to the beginning of the third season, Buffalo players are starting to revolt. I don't know if Remsen was gone or if anybody was protecting him, but what I found in the papers anyway was that the players were saying, let's get rid of. This is while in the International Association they're having troubles with what is Aniana and Binghamton and whatnot. Always had trouble with the Canadian teams. They just didn't want to see any black players.
But I think,
and they dropped him. They didn't reserve him.
I think what's interesting about that, because I did read about that as well, when going through my research, is that I always wondered if it was a chicken or the egg, because Frank moved from second base to right field in that final season, and he did play terrible. That's a given. The whole bloody team was awful. I mean, if you look at the stats of that Buffalo team, the whole team was terrible. I mean, they were literally middle of the pack, if not under 500, and they were just a bad team. So was it because of Frank Grant? He fell off, and, we talked about the consequences earlier in this discussion. Well, did they go through a losing slump? Did they have whatever happens to teams happen, and all of a sudden now he's under the microscope because of his color? Did he play bad?
Team, end up in Detroit then?
Yeah, they went to the Wolverines.
Yeah,
Chip Martin and I argue about that all the time. Or no, I'm sorry, that's earlier.
Grant, that was earlier. Grant went to the Cuban Giants. It was the first black team he played for.
In 87? Was that in 1887?
87 or 80. Here, I'm looking at his Wikipedia page
Whatever
real
his
quick.
third season in Baltimore. He was the only black player in the 19th century who played 3 seasons on the same team.
Right.
88.
Wow.
The end of the century, yeah.
Yep. Sorry for that segue, but like I said, I love those 3 of that story, and it's really interesting to me. But thanks for that extra background. I really appreciate it, Peter. Why did I say Peter? I'm sorry, Bob. Just looking at Peter.
Great stuff. So let's conclude. Overall thoughts of Volume 2. Did you like it more than Volume 1? Stronger? Weaker? What'd you think?
I thought it was minimally stronger. But I think he's learning how to put the books at. I thought the 3rd volume on the Players League was really good, and I thought the 4th volume was very good. I think he's learning how to do that.
That's a hint, Matt.
Yeah, that's part of the deal, right? Shocker, we're gonna go over the 3rd book. The next time I get to
God.
I have it right here.
That's the only one I don't have, but I do have the 4th one, so
I have that over there.
But I thought I was intrigued by the umpire chapters, primarily because umpires don't get a lot of coverage. In 19th century secondary resources, and when you see them in 19th century, primary resources, it's bad. Nobody likes the guys. So for him to kind of put everything together and come at umpires or address umpires rather from different angles, I thought was interesting. Interesting might be the best way I would put it. The arguments might have been a little bit stronger than the first book. But and again, my only real criticism of it is it's primarily a second half of the 1880s kind of book. It deals with primarily 4 seasons. And I did send he does mention in here that Tom Sucks, a player for a Union Association team, and oh, by the way, it wasn't really a major league anyway. I sent that to Justin McKinney to get his thoughts. So we'll see what he says about that. Any other overall thoughts? I don't want to bogart the time. Bless you.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah,
Enjoy.
sure.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It was awesome.
Matt, I'll ring you in a few minutes here.
Sounds great.
Okay.
Y'all have a good night. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks,
We'll
everyone.
be,
Thank you.
what is it?
And just
2
at
weeks?
the end of this month, I think it's
Yeah.
the 27th. Paul Langendorfer is going to be doing the sequel, which is Two in the Field. It's the sequel to the novel If I Never Get Back. So we'll find out what transpires beyond his time travel. So, I'm looking forward to that. Paul, thank you again, and Pat, thank you again for
Sure.
a great discussion here. There's a lot of good stuff in here.
See you guys. Everybody stay cool.
Good night, all.
Okay,
Good night.
too.
Take
See
care.
y'all.
Thank you, everybody.
all stay well.